God, we offer you this time, and we thank you that we have a big Bible to study and to glean things from, and just that every book, every verse reveals you and is worth knowing and talking about. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for Exodus and just the stories that reveal who you are and mean so much to us. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we are going to be in Exodus 13 through 15. Mainly the highlight is the Red Sea crossing today. Whoa. Hold on a minute. If I were to rank the greatest things that have ever happened in human history, crossing the Red Sea would want to be one of the top ones, right? After Jesus' birth and death and resurrection, of course, and after creation. But the fact that they crossed the Red Sea is not only an amazing miracle, but it shows that there's nobody like God. And God was accomplishing something bigger than just parting waters. He took one nation out of another and created a new kingdom out of the Red Sea. And it's pretty great. Spurgeon, if you ever read him or read things by him, he always has a way of saying things. That's probably why they called him the Prince of Preachers. But he says, "In the Red Sea of his own blood, our Redeemer has drowned the Pharaoh of our sins. Shall he not be Lord and King?" I think that's pretty true. And so, before we get, though, to the Red Sea, let's start in chapter 13. This is right after the Passover event in Exodus 12, and it's a continuation of that and because of that. And so because of Passover, Israel was to continue to do three things every year throughout the generations. The first thing was they were to consecrate their firstborn, okay? Consecrate their firstborn to God. Second thing was they were to commemorate, to remember the event through the festival of Passover and by teaching their kids. And the third thing, after they entered the Promised Land, they were supposed to redeem people and animals by death of a sacrifice of a lamb. So let's look at each of those, starting in Exodus 13, verses 1 and 2. He says this, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offering of every womb from the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal.'" So, does anybody know what it means to consecrate something? Set aside. And do you know any other words that mean that? Sanctify and holy. So, the word holy, the word sanctify, and the word consecrate are all the same word in Hebrew, kadosh, and all the same word in Greek, hagios. It means the same thing. It's just interesting that they have different flavors when we in English use them, right? The word holy, usually, this is really not the way you should use it, but people use the word holy in like a moral context. You need to act holy or do things holy. They kind of mean righteous by it. Sanctify kind of sounds like a theological word, doesn't it? Sanctification, that sounds like a big word. And consecration sounds like a ceremonial thing, doesn't it? We don't use the word consecrate very often, except for like that song, "Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee." But they all mean the same thing, which is to set apart or to dedicate someone or oneself to the service of God. To be holy or to be consecrated means to belong completely to God. And so the best illustration I've heard of this came from Carol Nelson. What it means to be holy or consecrated to God is kind of like your toothbrush, right? When you get that toothbrush out, it is your toothbrush. No one else is allowed to use it. It is holy to you. It is consecrated to you. You use it the first time. Nobody else is supposed to use it, right? It's to be used only by you and for you. And that's the same with when someone is holy or consecrated or sanctified to God. Your body or yourself is only to be for God, right? No one else can use it. It's only him, right? And so here in this passage, God is, right after the Passover, God says, consecrate to me every firstborn male. Those people are supposed to be only used for God. And Numbers 3 gives the reason. So this is 3:13 of Numbers. It says, for all the firstborn are mine. When I struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, I set apart for myself every firstborn in Israel, whether human or animal. They are mine. I am the Lord. So why the firstborn? Why didn't God consecrate the lastborn? Like what's the deal with that? Or just everybody? Why didn't he say everybody should be consecrated to me? What do you think? Don't all jump at once. Okay. Yeah. So Janine says, is that like first fruits? Yes, that is. Do you know the idea of first fruits was when your crops grew, you took the first fruits that grew and you gave them to God, right? But that was symbolic of the whole. Just like when we give our first fruits of our income, say, to God, it's saying that all of it is yours, Lord. But it's, this is just the first fruits because people need to live and they need money and all that stuff, right? But it's symbolic of the whole. And so in the same way, the Israelites, they needed to live their lives, right? They needed to do their jobs and do all those things. And so just the firstborn was to be consecrated, set aside to God, but it was representative of the whole, that he owns everybody, right? Not only that, but the firstborn were to be consecrated because, in effect, God was laying claim to each succeeding generation, right? If you have any kids that are going to continue the generation, at least you'll have a firstborn, right? And so the firstborn, if God claims every firstborn for all the generations, it means every generation belongs to him, right? And so the practice of setting aside the firstborn was almost surely related to the fact that Israel, the nation, was supposed to be God's firstborn son. You remember him saying that in Exodus 4? Israel is my firstborn son. And so the point of Israel having this special relationship with God was that they were kind of like the first fruits. They represented the whole of the earth because that nation was supposed to be God's in a special way. It represented that everybody on the planet belongs to God. Israel's kind of like the firstborn, right? Now, Jesus is called the firstborn too. And I don't think that is a coincidence. He was firstborn in three ways. He was the firstborn son of Mary. And you remember in Luke 2 when they take baby Jesus to the temple? They're doing the consecrating for the firstborn. They're doing what it says in Exodus 13, right? But he was also, Colossians 1:15, the firstborn over all creation. It doesn't mean that Jesus was actually like a creation of God, but that he had that rank of firstborn. He was the first person. He represents the whole, right? Because he was completely God's. And third in Colossians 1:18, he's the firstborn from among the dead. And so in the new creation, Jesus is the firstborn. And so it's sort of that idea, like everybody who belongs to Christ, Christ has many brothers and sisters. Everyone who belongs to Christ belongs to God. And Christ was that set aside, that holy person that he had chosen, right? So what does this have to do with us? There is a connection between deliverance from death and consecration. So consecration means recognizing that my life, which God redeemed through the death of his son, I should be dead because of my sins. But my life has been redeemed by God's son and now completely belongs to my Redeemer, right? Sanctification is something, or consecration is something that on the one hand God does, right? He sets us aside for himself. He's the one who does it and distinguishes that I belong to him. On the other hand, it's something that we're commanded to do as responsive and reflective obedience. So our obedience to God is not just I should be holy, it's I am holy, right? I belong to him. I can't do anything that that takes away his right over me, right, as a consecrated person. So that's the first thing. They were to consecrate because of the Passover, because God saved them. They were to consecrate their firstborn. They were also supposed to commemorate. And so remembering things that God had done was an important part of their faith in Israel, and it's an important part of ours too. So look at verse 3 of chapter 13. It says, it starts on, where is chapter 13? Oh, there it is. Then the Lord said to the people, commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And later on it says, when your kids are asking you, why aren't you eating this, or like leavened bread or things like that, then you have an answer. This is what God did for us. And so they're supposed to commemorate, and that commemoration is continued in the church. So the Israelites commemorated the day that God created the world by every week honoring the Sabbath. That's what that was about, is remembering God created the world, he's in control, right? And now every year they're supposed to commemorate when God saved them from Egypt by celebrating the Passover. They also were supposed to celebrate how God brought them through the wilderness by the Feast of Tabernacles. Every year, the whole family had a camping trip. They went outside and built shelters to remember how God, took care of them in the wilderness. And they had many other feasts, like every year, and sometimes every 7 years they had a Sabbath year, and every 50 years they had a Jubilee year, right? These were done for the purpose of remembering what God had done for them in history, and what God does for them every year. And that's an important thing too. I think that's why it's so important that we celebrate Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, other things. Every week we come together and gather, because we forget really easily, don't we? We get so wrapped up in other things in life, and we need the reminder, again and again, what God has done for us. Otherwise, we'll forget, and when you forget, you get stiff-necked real easy, right? One of my favorite Christians in history is not a very well-known person, but in college I lived in a dorm named after him. Samuel Morris was the guy. He was an African boy that was a prince of a tribal. His dad was a tribal chief, and they lost in the war, and so his dad gave him as a pawn to this other tribe, and he was put up on almost like a cross, and he was gonna die in a horrible way, and a light suddenly shone, and he was taken down from the cross, and the light led him all the way through the jungle, all the way to a place where a missionary was, right? And so Samuel Morris was just really interesting guy, especially in his prayer life. But all that to say, my point was, one thing that he did was he commemorated his deliverance day, which was on a Friday, by fasting every Friday. Just something that he did to remember that God saved him on that day and brought him new life. And so Christians, we need to be commemorating type of people too, right? Remembering things that have happened, especially Good Friday, Easter Day, and the Lord's Supper also is a commemoration, right? Every month we remember that Christ died for us. And so feasts like that, they gave parents the opportunity to hand down the faith, because naturally kids are curious and they ask questions. Why do we have to search for yeast in our houses once a year? This is weird, right? And get it all out. Or why can't we eat leavened bread during this week like we always do? Well, here's your answer. Because on the Exodus, we had to eat in such haste, right, that we couldn't use yeast, right? And so children learn best by show and tell. God's a good teacher. He knows this is how you do it, right? Now I have a question for us. Commemorating was such an important part of not only the Old Testament, but New Testament. Do you think our church does a good job at commemorating what God has done? Or do you think we could do better? You have any comments on that? Wow, it's quiet all around today. Okay, Mike.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you also need to remember that we're reminded of what God does every Sunday. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, we celebrate the resurrection every Sunday because
Yeah.
the resurrection happened on Sunday, right?
Yeah,
First day of the
yeah.
week, which is why we
So
meet together.
in that way, I would say yes. Now, could we do something else too? Perhaps I don't have an answer for that, but
Yeah.
that may be coming. Who knows?
Yeah. I think it's important. Jim. Oh, hold on. Here's a mic. Because we can't hear you on the thing without it.
I think that we don't thank God enough personally. That our prayers are always give me, give me, give me, and our prayers ought to be thank you, thank you, thank you, for what He's done for us, and what He just saving us from hell and everything is just. If we knew how much that was, we'd be on our knees, I think, just thanking Him all the time. And that's what I try to do in my prayers now, is to thank Him far, far more than what I asked for.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah. Well, I think commemorating as individuals and as a church is an important thing that we should try to do. Now, the last thing that they were supposed to do because of Passover was to redeem their firstborn. So look at chapter 13, verses 11 through 16. I'll read the first little bit. After the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you, as He promised on oath to your forefathers, you're to give over to the Lord the firstborn of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey, and if you don't redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. So, they're supposed to redeem every animal of their livestock, the firstborn, because Yahweh claimed that as belonging to Him. Every firstborn animal, then, was sacrificed to the Lord, except for donkeys. Why do you think donkeys couldn't be? Did people eat donkeys? No, they were an unclean animal, right? And so if they didn't redeem them, they just killed them, right? Broke their neck. Every firstborn son is to be redeemed. They do not give an option for sacrificing them, right? They have to be redeemed. And later on, if you read Numbers 18, verses 15 through 16, it talks about how the firstborn were redeemed by giving 5 shekels to the Levites who were serving in the sanctuary. So the money went to the temple for that. And then, again, I didn't read this part, but the redemption ceremony gives kids an opportunity to ask questions to their parents, and the parents are supposed to tell the kids, this is why we redeem, right? So, what do you do? What's the answer here? What do you do with a living person or animal that belongs to God? The obvious answer to an ancient person would be, if an animal or a person belongs to God, you sacrifice, right? You give to God things by making a sacrifice. And that's actually what sacrifice is all about, at least that kind of sacrifice. But what happens if you want to give something to God but not kill it like a human being? Well, you got to redeem it. You have to buy its life back, right? And you buy it back, you can only buy it back by giving, by sacrificing or offering something in its place. The person or animal that is redeemed still belongs to God, though, right? So even if you sacrifice a lamb, or even if you pay 5 shekels or whatever, that person still belongs to God. And instead of dying as a sacrifice, they live in service to God. And so, for instance, the Levitical priests lived in consecrated service to God at the temple. They didn't have their own inheritance. They didn't live their own lives. What they did was for God. Now, Christians are supposed to be living sacrifices, Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And that means that their lives belong totally to God. Even though they've been bought, they've been redeemed, they've been paid for, otherwise they would need to die. They've been redeemed, but now their lives are still a part of that redemption in that they live consecrated lives to his service, right? Okay, so now we move on to the crossing the Red Sea. In verse 17. So right now begins the long wilderness wanderings of the Israelites. So they journey from Egypt to the land of Canaan, the promised land. And does anybody have a guess how long it would take to walk on foot from Egypt to Canaan, to Israel? Huh? About 2.5 weeks. How long did it take them to get there? 40 years. It took 40 years. Now, going in a large nation, right, with kids and animals and all that stuff, that would take a lot longer than 2.5 weeks. But still, it wouldn't take 40 years. And the quickest way to Canaan, let me see if I can get this on now. See that at all? Yeah, a little bit. The quickest way to Canaan, I want to use this, see if I can do this, would be to go take this way, right? Up through Philistia, which is, I think, the Gaza Strip area. No. That's the quickest way, and a lot of people took that way. There's a nice path over there. But that way was taken by everybody and his brother, right? Everybody went this way. And so later on, like, Babylon and Assyria, they were way over here. See that, where my pointer is? Okay. But it always says, like in Jeremiah and stuff, that the armies would come from the north. That's because there's a huge desert here, and nobody crossed it. And so they would all come up over here and then go down this path to get over to Egypt so that they could fight with each other. And so there are always armies coming in and out of there, and the Philistines were pretty ugly brutes that you wouldn't want to fight. And so God says, I'm not going to take them that way, because if I do, these people are going to see an army come out of them, and even the thought of defeat is going to defeat them, right? It's not so much that they would be defeated, because God could obviously take care of them. It's that they would lose faith. That's what he's worried about. And God knows people well. He knows that our faith usually gives out before we actually face the difficulty that we're facing. And so God takes a different road. This is verse 18. God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea, and the Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. This translation is pretty, you've probably heard this, the translation Red Sea is pretty unfortunate. The original Hebrew does not say Red Sea. And if you look at your map right here, this if you look at any other map, like this little part of water is called the Red Sea. This is not what they crossed. They didn't go down all the way down here and cross over here. You can see their path. They went up here and crossed this little spot and back down. And in Hebrew, it doesn't say the word red. It says the word reed, the Reed Sea, Yom Suf. But since people are used to calling it the Red Sea, and it's one of the greatest events in history and in the Bible, modern translators have left it alone so that it wouldn't confuse people. That's why in your Bibles, you read Red Sea. But if you look on any map nowadays and you see Red Sea, don't think that that's what it's talking about. It was still a big body of water that they had to cross. There's a lot of water in this area, so it's not like the miracle is less or something because of that. But look at verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. This was the very last line of Genesis, by the way. Joseph said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones with you up from this place. Now, Joseph was a mummy at this time, which were real things, right? So they had to take the mummy of Joseph and carry it with them. But that was a visible symbol to all the people as they carried him for 40 years, his mummy around. That was a visible symbol of God's faithfulness. He's doing what he promised. He said he was going to take them up to the land, and now he's doing it. I wonder where they kept the mummy, by the way. Probably couldn't have kept it in the camp because it was a dead body. Yeah. That's interesting. He consecrated dead. I don't know. All right. Okay. Enough of that. Now, look at verse 20. After leaving Succoth, I don't know if you can see it on there, but it's on there. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert, and by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night the pillar of fire gave light to them, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Now, this pillar, I think it was the same pillar, whether it was fire or cloud, right? It was for people's guidance and their assurance of God's presence. And so inside the pillar was the visible manifestation of what humans can experience of God. The glory of God was in the pillar. And that cloud was covering them from being able to see God. And so the same thing sort of happens in the tabernacle. When you enter the most holy place, Aaron was supposed to bring incense that would create smoke so that there would be a barrier where he wouldn't see, right? And so here there's a barrier of cloud so the people wouldn't see. This is the same cloud that will cover Mount Sinai and fire, but it's just in a bigger thing, like the whole mountain's on fire, and God speaks out of the cloud, right? And out of the fire. And that is the same cloud that Moses enters into. Sometimes we miss how amazing this is. He enters into that cloud for 40 days and 40 nights. Jim? Hold on a second. Sloan's bringing it to you so we can get it on the video.
What chapter are we on?
It's still 13, end of 13.
Wasn't that cloud also a way to keep the people from moving out themselves because they were under a cloud? It was cooler than just walking away from it and being toast. That's what I've heard, is that's how he controlled the movement of it.
Well, he did. So whenever, this is Numbers 10, whenever the cloud came up from the tabernacle, the people would get ready to leave and go to some other place. And then when it ever settled back down in the tabernacle, they would stay sometimes for years at that place. I hadn't heard the thing about being cool. The fire would make sense, keep them warm at night in the desert. But this cloud, it appears in other places. The cloud that covers God's glory appears in other places in the prophets, in poetic literature, like the Psalms and other things. Ezekiel sees this cloud at the beginning of his book. He says, I looked, this is verse 4, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. And at the beginning of chapter 2, the next chapter, Ezekiel sees something like the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God, and he falls flat on his face. This same pillar of cloud appears in the New Testament at the Mount of Transfiguration. And Peter and James and John are up there, and they see Jesus' face transfigured, and they fall flat on their face like Ezekiel, and the cloud comes, and they enter the cloud. And who do they see? The glory of God. They see Jesus, right? Some people see a connection also between this cloud and the overshadowing of Mary, because it's the same word. The overshadowing of Mary in Luke 1:35, when the power of the Almighty will overshadow her, and she'll become pregnant with the Christ. And so there isn't any sense that there's an actual cloud there, but the same word there, which is a pretty rare word, is interesting. I'm not saying that I think that for sure, but that's a possibility. So this cloud is pretty important, and it shows up, and whenever it shows up, it means that God is present, right? He's guiding, his glory is there. So he's guiding them through there, and this is chapter 14, the actual crossing of the Red Sea. So now if the Passover is correlated with Jesus' death, right, as we talked about before, then the Red Sea correlates with his resurrection. They enter the sea of death, and they come out a new people. That's the idea. God's plan all along was to have Pharaoh take the bait and think that the Israelites were lost inside of the desert, that they were trapped, and that's why they're stuck there right around where that is, right? They're all hemmed in, Pharaoh thought, it says in chapter 14. And when he chased them, he brings his whole army with him. Now look, if you have your Bibles, look at verse 10 of chapter 14, 10 through 12. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Okay, this is their attitude the night before the Red Sea. Now look at chapter 15 and compare what I just read. Actually, the last verse of 14, verse 31 and 15:1. And when the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. And then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord, I will sing to the Lord, for he's highly exalted, the horse and its rider he's hurled into the sea. So let's compare. Before the Red Sea, the Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians, and they saw the Egyptians coming. After the Red Sea, the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord, it says. Before, they were terrified of Pharaoh, right? After, it says they feared the Lord. Before, they cried out in fear. After, they sang a song to the Lord. Before, they complained and grumbled. After, they worshiped with joy. And so it's a complete change in what they are afraid of. They fear the Lord now instead of Pharaoh, of their attitude, of their joy. Look at verse 13 and 14. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still. And so he tells them to do three things, right? He says, don't be afraid. That's the most frequent command in the Old Testament. Do not be afraid. Second, he says, stand firm and see, right? Just watch and look. And the last, he basically says, shut up, right? So in other words, stop fussing and just let God do his thing. He can take care of you. And maybe those three things we should get tattoos of or something, I don't know, on our foreheads. Remember, Sharpies. So this was not the first time that God performed a miracle by separating water, right, and making dry ground. So here he separates out the water, there's dry ground, they walk through. Do you remember any other time in the Bible, either before or after, where God separates the water and brings dry ground? Creation, right? And so that was before. You remember, we talked about this when I taught Genesis 1, that before there was anything, there was water. I know that's a little weird in our thinking, but water is nothingness. It's chaos. It's emptiness, right? God separates the water and makes something, brings function, brings creation. Here he separates the water and he brings out a new creation of his people, right? Can you think of any others? Yes, Mike.
Hello? He separated the water when they crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land?
That's right. He does it again in Joshua chapter 3 when he makes all the Jordan pile up at one part, the water, and then they can walk through. Yeah. I wonder if anybody else remembers. Oh, yep. Yeah, Carol got it. Elijah. Remember this story in 2 Kings 2? He takes what was it? mantle, yeah, and he rolls it up and he strikes the water and he walks across with the prophets. And actually, Elisha does the same thing after, right? And so I think maybe even the flood a little bit after God pushes the waters back, right? At least in the creation, if not other places, the theme of separating waters and making dry ground is all about making something new, right? Bringing out a new people. And that's what's happening here. God is bringing out a new people, separating them from their old life in Egypt, and bringing a resurrection of sorts, right? And that's the symbol also with baptism, I think. Actually, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, talking about this event with the Red Sea, he says they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, right? And so we're baptized and brought out of water a new creation, so to speak, a new person. Yes, Mike?
Yeah. I would add that we were baptized into his death. That's important to know. We went down with him.
Yeah.
And died to sin and rose a new creation.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the symbol with Passover too. These people have died to their old Egyptian way of life, or they should have died, and they were redeemed and brought into a new life. That's good. Thank you. It's interesting at the end of Revelation, one of the things he says is, in the new heaven and the new earth, there will be no more sea. There's no more of the old chaos, the old life. It's dried up, right? Probably, though, in heaven, you can still sit by the ocean. And I don't think that means, that. But if that's the sort of thing you like. All right, so we've crossed the Red Sea, and their response is worship. If you look at chapter 15, the whole thing up until verse 18 is kind of like a psalm, right? A poem. They're all singing, right? Moses and all the Israelites and Miriam, his sister. Worship is the proper response to God's deeds and salvation, which is why we so many of our hymns, so many of our songs focus on Christ's death and his resurrection. Like that's something to worship and sing about, just like they sang about this. There's a lot of singing in the Bible, and I think that's why we sing in church still too. It's something God has always wanted and commanded, and it's when you sing. I know this is kind of random, but just some thoughts of mine. If we were to try to pray together, it would be difficult. But when you put a prayer on the screen and you put some music to it and a tune, we can all pray together and worship through song. And I think that's something that's kind of special. Music is supposed to reflect the beauty and the tones of the words we speak. At one point in Revelation, this is chapter 15, the believers will have watched God's power and how he's destroying the nations, but he's sparing his own people. And this is what it says. I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign, 7 angels with 7 last plagues. Last because with them God's wrath is completed. And I saw that what looked like a sea of glass, glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast and its image and over the number of its name. And they held harps given them by God, and they sang the song of God's servant Moses and of the Lamb. And so in Revelation, it's trying to remind us back of Exodus 15, when they had just crossed the Red Sea. And they sang this, great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. The book of Revelation, I feel like I talk about it a lot, but it's because the Old Testament, it's so much of its truth is coming directly from the Old Testament, right? And Revelation, that's what it's doing. It's revealing the meaning of the Old Testament and everything God had promised and planned, right? And so here, what it's saying is there's going to be another Exodus. We are like the Israelites trapped in Egypt, oppressed by Satan and his power over the nations, that the church is. But there will come a day of deliverance where we will sing, just like they did, where God will bring us out, and the sea will be like glass, and everything will be the way it's supposed to be. And so there's a hope for us in that. Couple more things before I let you go about chapter 15. Look at verse 3. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Do you think about God like that, as a warrior? It's a common designation of God in the Old Testament. He's a fighter. And I think it's something that we don't often think about, and that he fights on behalf of his people, right? Look at verse 7. It says, "In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble." We'll talk about this in more detail, but, I think it offends our sensibilities sometimes that God gets angry and even hates people or hates things. We read that, we try to read over it or explain it or things like that. And one thing that's important to understand is that offense is a completely modern thing. I sometimes think that our ability to feel emotions is one of the most godlike things about us. And so God, he felt burning anger on behalf of his people, right? God is capable of all sorts of emotions, probably to a greater extent than any of us. And God's a person after all, isn't he? And he wouldn't be much of a person if he couldn't feel things. And so the difference between God and us is that our emotions are often perverted, and they're expressed in the wrong times and the wrong ways and in sinful ways, right? God, who feels the same emotions in a lot of ways, but feels them perfectly and acts appropriately with them, is what the difference is. And so he did feel burning anger. This Red Sea thing came out of anger, and yet it was just and it was righteous because it was God. And so as we get further on in Exodus, when God will put people to death and things like that, and we'll see his anger, I don't think we should shy away from it, but we should ask questions like, what's going on here? What does this mean about God? I haven't watched The Chosen. I know a lot of people like it, but I did see a scene once, and in the scene, Jesus was, the guy who plays Jesus, was smiling and laughing. And it struck me weird, like, that's not how I ever thought about Jesus. And I think I was wrong. I'm sure Jesus laughed and smiled and was friendly, and he was joyful. But just, I think we need to really look at the scriptures and think, like, who is God and what's he like? And as we get further on in Exodus, I think that'll help us. The Old Testament helps us with that. So, all right. Thank you for coming. Thanks for listening.